The surveillance footage would later show exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds for Bradley Hutchinson's entire world to crumble at Riverside High School. The same Bradley who had terrorized teachers for 2 years, whose father's law firm kept the school board in his pocket, whose racist remarks had driven out 3 educators before her. But when he called the new teacher monkey to her face that October morning, expecting the usual tears and resignation letter, he discovered that Naomi Parker wasn't just any teacher. She was a former MMA fighter with a record that could have landed her in the octagon instead of the classroom. By the end of this story, you'll see how one perfectly executed combination punch can transform an entire school's culture forever. Hit that notification bell because this confrontation ended with sirens, expelled students, and a lesson about respect that echoed through every hallway in America. Riverside High had always been where privilege protected the predators, where money silenced the truth, and where teachers learned to look the other way or find new careers. If you've ever witnessed something that made your blood boil, drop a comment about how you handled it. Because what happened at Riverside High that day changed everything about how we think about standing up to injustice. Sometimes the most powerful response comes from the most unexpected source. Naomi Parker stood 5 feet 6 inches of pure determination, with warm brown skin, natural hair styled in neat locks, and eyes that held both intelligence and something far more dangerous, patience. At 29, she'd left behind a promising MMA career after a shoulder injury ended her championship dreams. 3 years of recovery and a master's degree in education later, she'd found her new calling, shaping young minds and breaking down barriers in predominantly white suburban schools. She'd grown up in Detroit, where survival meant learning to fight before you learned algebra. Her father, a mechanic with calloused hands and an iron will, had enrolled her in martial arts when neighborhood bullies targeted her for being the smart girl. What started as self-defense evolved into artistry, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, Muay Thai, boxing, wrestling. By 18, she was competing professionally. By 25, she had 12 wins, 2 losses, and a highlight reel that made grown men wince. But Naomi had hung up her gloves, not from fear, but from a higher calling. She'd seen too many kids like her former self, brilliant, determined, but beaten down by systems that never gave them a fair chance. Teaching wasn't her backup plan, it was her ultimate fight. Bradley Hutchinson was 18 years old, 6'2", with the kind of blonde hair and blue eyes that made mothers clutch their purses tighter around anyone who didn't look like him. As the star linebacker for Riverside's championship football team, he ruled the school with the casual cruelty that only comes from never facing real consequences. His father, Richard Hutchinson, was the most powerful attorney in the county, the kind of man who could make lawsuits disappear and ensure his son's disciplinary records stayed clean. Bradley had perfected the art of racist intimidation without leaving fingerprints. He knew exactly which words to use, which teachers would stay silent, which administrators would look the other way. In his 2 years at Riverside, he'd created a toxic atmosphere where teachers of color rarely lasted more than a semester. His methods were psychological warfare wrapped in plausible deniability, the accidental shoulder check, the monkey noise during presentations, the jokes that cut deep but couldn't be proven in court. His crew consisted of Marcus Thompson and Tyler Brooks, 2 fellow athletes whose family wealth bought them immunity from consequences. They moved through the halls like sharks, sensing weakness and striking without mercy. Together, they turned Riverside High into their personal kingdom, where fear masqueraded as respect and silence enabled cruelty. Riverside High School sprawled across 15 acres of manicured suburban perfection in Millbrook County, Virginia, with its red brick facades, gleaming trophy cases, and 97% college acceptance rate. It represented everything American parents dreamed of for their children. The student parking lot showcased BMWs and Mercedes that cost more than most teachers' annual salaries. The football stadium, funded by wealthy boosters, could seat 4,000 screaming fans every Friday night. But beneath the academic excellence and athletic achievement lurked a darker truth. The school's demographics told the story. 85% white, 10% Asian, 3% Hispanic, and exactly 2% black. Those numbers weren't accidental. They reflected decades of housing policies, zoning decisions, and economic barriers that kept Riverside's classrooms looking remarkably homogeneous. For teachers of color, Riverside represented both opportunity and trial by fire. The salaries were excellent, the resources abundant. But the cultural challenges were immense. Previous black educators had lasted an average of 8 months before transferring, citing cultural fit issues that everyone understood but nobody discussed openly. Naomi's first week had been deceptively peaceful. Her AP literature classes were engaged, IR lesson plans, innovative, and her gradebook filled with impressive scores. She decorated her classroom with quotes from Maya Angelou, James Baldwin, and Toni Morrison, alongside Shakespeare and Hemingway. Most students seemed genuinely excited about her fresh perspective on classic texts. But she'd noticed the whispers that stopped when she entered rooms, the way certain students' parents requested conferences about curriculum concerns, and how some colleagues offered sympathetic smiles without making eye contact. The previous teacher, Mrs. Williams, had left mid-semester after what the principal delicately called philosophical differences about classroom management. It was Marcus who'd tested the waters first, making subtle comments about urban literature when Naomi assigned Langston Hughes. When she'd addressed it professionally, he'd back down with mock innocence. Tuiler had tried different tactics, questioning her qualifications during class discussions and suggesting maybe someone with more traditional experience should teach AP courses. But Bradley had remained silent, watching, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The first direct attack came during third period on a Tuesday in early October. Naomi was discussing symbolism in To Kill a Mockingbird when Bradley raised his hand with theatrical politeness. "Miss Parker," he began, emphasizing her unmarried status with subtle condescension. "Don't you think this book is kind of outdated? I mean, racism isn't really a problem anymore, especially not in schools like ours." The classroom fell silent. 26 students held their breath as Naomi recognized the trap. Agree, and she'd be validating willful ignorance. Disagree too forcefully, and she'd be labeled the angry black woman who brought politics into literature. "That's an interesting perspective, Bradley," she replied calmly, her MMA training keeping her breathing steady. "Can you think of any modern examples that might suggest otherwise?" "Not really," he shrugged. "I think people who focus on race are the real problem. Like, if you just act normal, nobody cares what color you are." Marcus snickered. Tyler nodded sagely. Several other students shifted uncomfortably, sensing the undercurrent but afraid to challenge the school's golden boy. Naomi had faced this exact scenario in her teacher training, but experiencing it felt different. The casual dismissal of centuries of struggle, the implication that her very existence in their classroom was somehow abnormal, the way Bradley's eyes held a cold satisfaction at her discomfort. "Well," she said, maintaining her professional composure, "literature helps us explore different perspectives. Perhaps we can examine how various characters in the novel experience their world differently based on their circumstances." Bradley smiled, not the warm expression of an engaged student, but the predatory grin of someone who'd landed the first blow. He'd successfully derailed the lesson, made her defensive, and established that he could push boundaries without consequences. After class, as students filed out, Bradley lingered by her desk. "You know, Miss Parker, my dad went to law school with the superintendent. He's always interested in hearing about new teaching methods." The threat was paper-thin but unmistakable. Step out of line, and powerful people would know about it. Naomi looked up from her lesson plans, meeting his gaze with the same intensity she'd once reserved for opponents stepping into the cage. "I appreciate your father's interest in education, Bradley. I'm sure he values teachers who prepare students for the real world." Something flickered across Bradley's face, surprise at her lack of visible fear, annoyance at her refusal to be intimidated. He'd expected stammering, maybe tears, certainly submission. Instead, he'd encountered calm professionalism backed by something he couldn't quite identify. That afternoon, Naomi found her car keyed in the parking lot, Security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during lunch period. The escalation came 2 weeks later during homecoming week. Riverside High buzzed with school spirit as students decorated hallways and prepared for Friday night's big game. Naomi had volunteered to supervise hallway decorations during lunch. Hoping to connect with students outside the classroom, she was admiring a particularly creative banner when she heard the sounds, soft but unmistakable monkey noises coming from behind her. When she turned, Bradley and his crew were innocently arranging streamers, but the snickering faces of nearby students told the story. "Did you guys hear something?" Naomi asked, her voice steady but her heart racing. "Hear what? Miss Parker?" Bradley's blue eyes were wide with false innocence. "We're just working on decorations." The noises resumed the moment she turned back to her clipboard. This time, when she spun around, she saw Bradley's mouth forming the shapes, though he snapped it shut before she could catch him in the act. "Bradley, I need to speak with you privately." "Actually, Miss Parker, we're kind of busy with this school spirit stuff. Maybe during office hours?" More students had gathered, sensing drama. Some looked uncomfortable, others excited by the brewing confrontation. This was Bradley's specialty, creating public scenes where calling him out would make her look unreasonable, while staying silent would signal weakness. "Now, Bradley," he exchanged glances with Marcus and Tyler, then followed her to a quiet corner of the hallway. His posture radiated casual defiance, shoulders loose, hands in pockets. The body language of someone who'd never faced real consequences. "I know what you were doing," Naomi said quietly. "The noises, the behavior, it stops now." Bradley tilted his head with mock confusion. "I'm sorry, Miss Parker, but I really don't know what you're talking about. Maybe you're a little stressed? First year teaching here and all." The gaslighting was masterful, suggesting she was imagining things while offering a plausible explanation rooted in her newcomer status. Around them, students pretended to work while straining to overhear. "Bradley, I've been very patient." "But, patient?" His voice rose just enough for others to hear. "Miss Parker, are you saying I did something wrong? Because I've just been working on school decorations like you asked." Now she was trapped. Escalate. And she looked like she was picking on a student who was just trying to help. Back down, and the message would be clear. Bradley Hutchinson was untouchable. Naomi took a deep breath, centering herself the way her first MMA coach had taught her. In the cage, emotional reactions got you knocked out. In the classroom, they got you fired. "Let's just focus on the decorations," she said finally. Bradley's smile was triumphant. He'd won round 2. And everyone knew it. That evening, Naomi found a banana peel in her classroom mailbox. The breaking point came 3 days later. During 5th period AP Literature, Naomi was leading a discussion about power dynamics in Othello when Bradley decided to make his move. The lesson was going well, students were engaged, making thoughtful connections between Shakespeare's themes and modern society. "It's interesting how Iago manipulates Othello's insecurities," said Jessica Chen, one of Naomi's brightest students. "He knows exactly which buttons to push." "Excellent observation." "Jessica, can anyone identify what specific insecurities Iago exploits?" Several hands went up, but Bradley spoke without waiting to be called on. "Well, obviously Othello's insecure because he doesn't belong. He's different from everyone else. And deep down, he knows it." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Every student understood the subtext. The parallel Bradley was drawing between the Moorish general and their black teacher. That's one interpretation. Naomi replied carefully. "What textual evidence supports that view?" Bradley leaned back in his chair, his confidence growing with the silence around him. "I mean, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? He's this outsider trying to fit into a society that's way more sophisticated than what he's used to, and when people see through his act, he gets violent." The attack was surgical in its precision. Every word could be defended as literary analysis while delivering a devastating personal assault. Several students looked shocked, others fascinated by the drama unfolding before them. Marcus jumped in to support his friend. "Yeah. And he's so paranoid about not fitting in that he sees racism everywhere, even when people are just being honest." Tyler nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. Like, maybe if he just focused on doing his job instead of looking for problems, people would respect him more. The coordinated attack was clear now. This wasn't spontaneous teenage cruelty. It was a calculated assault designed to humiliate Naomi in front of her students while maintaining plausible deniability. If she responded emotionally, she'd prove their point about being violent and paranoid. If she stayed silent, they'd won. But these boys had made a crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed Naomi was like their previous victims, teachers who'd bend and break under pressure. They didn't realize they were facing someone who'd spent years learning to stay calm under much more intense pressure than 3 privileged teenagers could deliver. Those are interesting character analyses, Naomi said, her voice steady as granite. Let's examine the text more carefully. For the next 20 minutes, she systematically dismantled their arguments using literary evidence, critical thinking, and the kind of intellectual precision that left no room for ambiguity. She turned their attack into a teaching moment about projection, about how characters who accuse others of paranoia often reveal their own insecurities. By the end of class, Bradley's face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. He'd thrown his best punch and not only failed to land it, but found himself outclassed in every exchange. As students filed out, he lingered behind. You think you're pretty smart, don't you? His mask of politeness had finally slipped, revealing the ugly hatred underneath. I think I'm pretty prepared, Naomi replied, not looking up from her papers. My dad knows people. You know, important people. Teachers who don't fit in here usually figure that out pretty quick. Now Naomi looked up, and for the first time, Bradley saw something in her eyes that made him step back instinctively. It wasn't anger or fear. It was the cold assessment of a predator recognizing another predator. Bradley, she said softly, I've met important people. Real, important people. The kind who aren't impressed by daddy's money or high school football trophies. Something in her tone, in the way she held herself, sent a primal warning signal through Bradley's nervous system. For 18 years, he'd relied on intimidation and privilege to get his way. But standing in that classroom, facing this teacher who refused to break, he felt something he'd never experienced before. Genuine uncertainty. This isn't over, he muttered, turning toward the door. No, Naomi agreed, her voice carrying a promise that made his skin crawl. It's not. Friday afternoon arrived with the electric energy that always accompanied game day at Riverside High. The halls buzzed with blue and gold spirit wear, last-minute homework exchanges, and the nervous excitement of teenagers anticipating weekend freedom. Naomi had survived her first month, but she could feel the tension building like atmospheric pressure before a storm. The confrontation that would change everything began in the faculty parking lot at 3:45 p.m. Naomi was loading her weekend, grading into her Honda Civic when she heard voices approaching from behind. She recognized Bradley's laugh before she turned around, that particular blend of privilege and cruelty that made her stomach tighten. Hey, Miss Parker, Bradley called out, his voice carrying the false friendliness that always preceded his attacks. Marcus and Tyler flanked him like bodyguards, their Letterman jackets making them look older and more intimidating in the afternoon shadows. Several other students had gathered nearby, some heading to cars, others lingering to watch whatever was about to unfold. Word traveled fast at Riverside when Bradley Hutchinson was on the move. Bradley, Naomi acknowledged, closing her car door and turning to face them. Her years in the cage had taught her never to show her back to potential threats. We were just talking about your class, Bradley continued, moving closer with each word. And we realized we never properly welcomed you to our school. The setup was perfect from his perspective. Public location, multiple witnesses, complete plausible deniability for whatever came next. Naomi recognized the tactical positioning. They'd boxed her in against her car, with the crowd forming a loose semicircle behind them. I appreciate that, but I need to get going, she said, reaching for her door handle. Oh, come on. Don't be like that, Marcus interjected, stepping sideways to block her path. We're just being friendly. Tyler moved to her other side, completing the trap. Yeah, We want to make sure you feel welcomed. The pause before welcomed carried unmistakable menace. Naomi felt her heart rate increase. But not from fear. From the familiar pre-fight adrenaline that her body still remembered after 3 years away from competition. "You know," Bradley said, his voice dropping to a more intimate register that only she could hear clearly. "My dad was asking about you. Says the school board's been getting some complaints." "What kind of complaints?" Naomi kept her voice level. "Professional." "Oh. The usual stuff. Parents worried about curriculum choices, teaching methods, whether someone with your background is really the right fit for our students." Each pause was a verbal landmine, designed to convey maximum offense while maintaining technical innocence. But Bradley wasn't done. He also mentioned that positions like yours are pretty competitive. Lots of qualified candidates who understand our community values. The threat was crystal clear now. Comply, submit, or face manufactured complaints that would end her career before it started. Naomi had seen this playbook before, the systematic destruction of educators who refused to stay in their assigned place. "I see," she said quietly. "And what exactly would demonstrate that I understand your community values?" Bradley's smile widened, sensing victory. This was the moment he lived for, the psychological break, the submission that proved his power. "Well, for starters, maybe focusing on traditional literature instead of all that urban stuff. And definitely not making everything about race. Parents don't want their kids feeling guilty about being successful." "Urban stuff," Naomi repeated, her voice deadly calm. "You know what I mean," Bradley said, his confidence growing with each word. "All that angry black writer stuff. Maybe stick to authors who understand American values." A collective intake of breath rippled through the watching students. Even for Bradley, this was crossing lines that smart bullies usually avoided. But success had made him sloppy. "Arrogant. American values," Naomi echoed. And now something had changed in her tone that made Marcus and Tyler exchange uncertain glances. "Exactly," Bradley pressed on, oblivious to the shift. "My dad says this school has a reputation to maintain. We can't have teachers who make students uncomfortable by bringing their personal issues into the classroom." "Personal issues? Come on. You know what I'm talking about." Bradley stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her ears. "Maybe if you acted more like you belonged here instead of playing the victim all the time, people would take you seriously." The watching students couldn't hear his words, but they could see Naomi's posture straightening, her hands falling to her sides in a way that somehow looked both relaxed and dangerous. "And if I don't?" she asked softly. Bradley's grin was pure predator now. "Well, like I said, my dad knows important people, including the people who decide which teachers get renewed and which ones find opportunities elsewhere." He paused, savoring the moment of what he believed was total victory. "But hey, maybe you'd be happier teaching somewhere more suitable. Urban schools always need teachers, right? You could go back where you belong." The final insult hung in the air, like smoke from a discharged weapon. Bradley had finally said what he'd been building toward for weeks, that Naomi didn't belong, had never belonged, and never would belong in his world. What he didn't realize was that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his 18-year life because Naomi Parker had spent 3 years learning to control her temper, to channel her anger into focused energy, to wait for exactly the right moment to strike. And as she looked into Bradley's smug, privileged face, she realized that moment had finally arrived. "You want to know something about belonging, Bradley?" Naomi's voice carried a new quality that made the gathering crowd lean in instinctively. Bradley nodded, still riding the high of his perceived dominance. "Sure. And lie to me. I've belonged in places that would eat you alive before breakfast." The words were spoken softly, but they carried the weight of absolute certainty. For the first time in the conversation, Bradley looked uncertain. What's that supposed to mean? Instead of answering directly, Naomi took a single step forward. It should have been insignificant, just 2 feet of movement, but something about the way she moved made Marcus and Tyler unconsciously step back. "It means I've been in cages with women who could break your father's law degree in half with their bare hands." It means I've faced down opponents who made your worst nightmares look like bedtime stories. And it means that every second you've been running your mouth, I've been calculating exactly how to put you on the ground without breaking school district policy. Bradley's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and the first flicker of genuine fear. You're threatening me? In front of witnesses? No. Bradley, I'm educating you. The crowd had grown now. Drawn by the electric tension crackling between them, phone cameras were emerging from pockets and purses, capturing what everyone sensed would be a moment worth remembering. See, you've spent your whole life thinking power comes from daddy's money and mama's connections. Naomi continued, her voice never rising above conversational level. But real power? Real power comes from knowing exactly who you are and refusing to let anyone tell you different. Marcus tried to insert himself into the conversation. Look, Miss Parker, we were just… Shut up. Marcus. The command was delivered without heat, without emotion, but with such absolute authority that he stopped mid-sentence like he'd been slapped. Tyler made the mistake of reaching toward Naomi's shoulder, possibly to physically intimidate her. She didn't even look at him as her hand moved in a blur, catching his wrist and applying just enough pressure to make him gasp and pull back. Don't, she said simply. The demonstration lasted less than 2 seconds. But everyone present understood they'd just witnessed something extraordinary. Tyler was 6'1" and 200 pounds of football muscle. And this teacher had controlled him like he was a misbehaving child. Bradley's mouth opened and closed as he processed what he'd just seen. His carefully constructed reality was beginning to crack around the edges. You can't touch students, he said weakly, grasping for familiar ground. That's assault. My dad will. Your dad will what? Bradley? Naomi's smile was razor sharp. File a lawsuit because I prevented your friend from putting his hands on me? Please? Make that call. I'd love to explain to a jury how 3 teenage boys cornered their female teacher in a parking lot. The legal implications hit Bradley like cold water. Suddenly, his position didn't look quite as strong as it had moments before. But more importantly, Naomi continued, her voice carrying to every student in the growing crowd. You want to talk about belonging? About American values? Let me tell you what American values look like. She gestured to the watching faces surrounding them. White, black, Hispanic, Asian students, all united in rapt attention. American values look like a girl from Detroit who fought her way out of poverty with her fists and her brain. American values look like earning everything you get instead of inheriting it. American values look like standing up to bullies instead of being one. Bradley's face was crimson now. Humiliation and rage warring for control. You think you're so special because you know karate or whatever? Mixed martial arts. Naomi corrected. And not just knowing, excelling. 12 wins. 2 losses. 3 title shots. I could show you my highlight reel, but your parents might find it disturbing. The revelation sent a ripple of excitement through the crowd. Students who'd grown up watching UFC suddenly understood they were looking at a real fighter. Not just their English teacher. So here's what's going to happen. Bradley, Naomi said, her voice carrying the finality of a judge, delivering a verdict. You're going to stop. The comments, the threats, the racist jokes, all of it. You're going to treat me and every other teacher in this building with the respect that our education and experience deserves. And if I don't? Bradley's voice cracked slightly on the question. Naomi's smile was absolutely terrifying in its pleasantness. Then you'll discover that some lessons can't be learned from textbooks. The confrontation that started in a parking lot was about to move inside the school, where surveillance cameras would capture every moment of what happened next. Bradley Hutchinson thought he knew how power worked in his world, but he was about to learn that some forces can't be bought, intimidated, or silenced. And when the final bell rang that Friday afternoon, everyone at Riverside High would understand that their school had just changed forever. Bradley's world was crumbling, and everyone could see it. The confident swagger that had defined him for 18 years was evaporating under the steady gaze of a woman who refused to be intimidated. But cornered animals are often the most dangerous, and Bradley Hutchinson was about to prove that privilege dies hard. You know what I think? Bradley said. his voice getting louder as desperation crept in. "I think you're just another angry black woman who can't handle being in a real school with real standards." The crowd gasped audibly, even by Riverside standards. The naked racism was shocking. Several students immediately started recording. Sensing they were witnessing something that would define their high school experience forever, Naomi felt something shift inside her chest. Not anger, but a cold, crystalline clarity that she recognized from her fighting days. It was the moment when emotion transforms into precision, when fury becomes focus. "Say that again?" "Bradley," she said quietly. "You heard me." Bradley was fully committed now, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "Angry. Black. Woman. That's all you are. And that's all you'll ever be. No matter how many degrees you have, or how tough you think you are." Marcus and Tyler exchanged nervous glances. Even they understood that Bradley had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But their leader was in full meltdown mode. 18 years of unchecked privilege, finally meeting an immovable object. "My father didn't donate $500,000 to this school, so some ghetto trash could come here and—" The word died in his throat as he suddenly found himself looking up at Naomi from a very different angle. To the watching students, it had appeared almost magical. One moment Bradley was standing and ranting. The next, he was sitting on the asphalt. His legs swept out from under him so smoothly it looked choreographed. "The word you're looking for is educated," Naomi said, standing over him with her hands at her sides. "Educated black woman? Try to keep up." Bradley scrambled to his feet, his face burning with humiliation. The carefully maintained image of untouchable superiority had shattered in front of the entire school. Phone cameras captured every second of his degradation. "You? You can't," he stammered, confusion replacing arrogance. "Can't what? Bradley? Can't exist in your space? Can't challenge your assumptions? Can't defend myself when 3 boys try to intimidate me?" Each question hit like a physical blow. Naomi's voice remained calm, but her words carried the weight of centuries of women who'd refused to bow to bullies. Tyler, desperate to save face for his friend, stepped forward aggressively. "This is bull. You can't put your hands on students." "Tyler," Naomi said without turning toward him, "if you take one more step, I'll demonstrate exactly what putting hands on students actually looks like." The threat wasn't shouted or dramatic. It was delivered with the casual confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of. Tyler froze mid-step, suddenly understanding that his size advantage meant nothing to a woman who'd spent years learning to neutralize bigger, stronger opponents. Bradley finally found his voice again, though it came out as more of a snarl. "My father will destroy you for this. You'll never teach again. Your father," Naomi interrupted, pulling out her phone. "Might want to see this first?" She held up the device, showing the recording she'd been making since the conversation began. Every word, every threat, every racist slur had been captured in crystal clear audio. "I've also been documenting everything for weeks. Bradley, the comments, the intimidation attempts, the monkey noises, all of it. Amazing what these little devices can record when you're not paying attention." The color drained from Bradley's face as the implications hit him. In the age of social media and viral videos, his words would have consequences far beyond his father's ability to control. "But let's talk about your father," Naomi continued, her voice taking on an almost conversational tone. "Richard Hutchinson, senior partner at Hutchinson, Morrison and Associates. The same Richard Hutchinson who's currently being investigated by the Virginia State Bar for campaign finance violations." Bradley's mouth fell open. "How do you know about that, Bradley? Did you really think I came to this job without doing my homework? Your father's firm represents some very interesting clients. Clients who might not appreciate being associated with racist harassment of teachers." The psychological warfare was complete. Every weapon Bradley had tried to use against her, his father's influence, his social position, his assumptions about her background, had been turned against him with surgical precision. "You see," Naomi said, addressing not just Bradley but the entire crowd of students, "bullies always assume their victims are powerless. They never consider that those victims might have powers they can't imagine. Marcus, seeing his friend's complete psychological collapse, decided to try a different approach. "Look, Miss Parker, maybe we can all just calm down and—" "Marcus," Naomi said, finally turning her full attention to him, "you've been filming students in the locker room and selling the videos online." The accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his face going white. "That's... How did you—" "Anonymous tip to my email last week, along with screenshots of your Snapchat conversations and your Venmo transactions. Amazing what students will share when they trust their teacher." The revelations sent shockwaves through the crowd. Several female students looked horrified, suddenly understanding they'd been victimized by someone they'd trusted. Tyler tried to run, but Naomi's voice stopped him cold. "Tyler Brooks. 3 DUI arrests that daddy's money made disappear. Plus that hit and run last spring that left Mrs. Chen's mailbox destroyed and her dog injured." Tyler's world imploded in real time. The secret he'd carried for months, the guilt that had been eating him alive, was suddenly public knowledge. "How?" Tyler whispered. "Because victims talk to people they trust. Tyler, and sometimes those people are teachers who actually listen." Bradley looked around desperately at his crumbling empire. His crew was exposed. His tactics had failed, and his assumed superiority had evaporated. But the worst part was the crowd of students surrounding them. Kids who'd feared him for years now, looking at him with something far worse than hatred, pity. "This isn't over," he said weakly. But the words carried no weight. Everyone present could see that it absolutely was over. "You're right," Naomi agreed. "Because now comes the part where you face actual consequences." As if summoned by cosmic timing, Principal Morrison's voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" The crowd parted to reveal Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a 60-year-old woman with silver hair and the kind of steel spine that came from 30 years in education. Behind her stood Officer Jenkins, the school's resource officer, and Mr. Davis, the vice principal. "Dr. Morrison," Naomi said calmly, "we were just having a discussion about American values and appropriate behavior." Bradley saw his last chance for narrative control. "She attacked me. She threatened all of us. I want her arrested." "Attacked you? Doctor?" Morrison's eyebrows rose as she looked at Bradley, who was clearly uninjured, standing next to Marcus and Tyler, who looked more terrified than hurt. "She swept my legs and threatened us with violence." "Doctor." Morrison turned to the crowd of students, all of whom were holding phones. "I suppose none of you recorded any of this?" A forest of hands went up, dozens of students eager to share their footage of the confrontation. "Interesting, Doctor," Morrison said dryly. "Officer Jenkins, perhaps we should review some evidence before making any decisions about arrests." For the next 10 minutes, various students shared their recordings. The accumulated footage told the complete story: Bradley's racist taunts, his crew's intimidation tactics, Naomi's controlled responses, and the revelation of the boys' criminal activities. Dr. Morrison's expression grew darker with each video. As a veteran educator, she'd seen bullying before, but the systematic nature of Bradley's harassment and the criminal allegations against his friends represented something far more serious. "Mr. Hutchinson," she said finally. "Mr. Thompson. Mr. Brooks. My office. Now, my father will be here in 20 minutes, Bradley threatened. "And when he gets here?" "When he gets here," Dr. Morrison interrupted, "he'll find out that his son has been engaging in racist harassment, that Mr. Thompson has been recording and distributing illegal videos, and that Mr. Brooks has been concealing criminal activity. I suspect that conversation will be very interesting." The three boys were escorted inside, their reign of terror ending, not with violence but with accountability. As they disappeared through the school doors, a cheer went up from the watching students. Naomi stood in the center of it all, not celebrating but processing what had just happened. She'd come to teach literature and found herself fighting a war she'd never expected to face. Within hours, the story had spread throughout Riverside High like wildfire. Students who'd lived in fear of Bradley's crew for years suddenly felt free to share their own experiences. The anonymous tip line, Dr. Fifth Morrison had established was flooded with reports about the trio's behavior. Marcus broke first. Faced with criminal charges and the possibility of being tried as an adult, he confessed to the voyeurism charges and agreed to surrender all the illegal recordings. His tears in Dr. Morrison's office were genuine, not from remorse, but from the sudden realization that actions have consequences. Tyler's confession came next. The hit and run that had haunted him for months poured out in a sobbing admission that led to immediate criminal charges. His parents' money couldn't protect him from felony charges captured on security footage, but Bradley held out until his father arrived. Richard Hutchinson stormed into the school like he owned it, which in many ways he had. He'd donated money, influenced policy, and protected his son from consequences for years. But as he sat in Dr. Morrison's office watching video after video of his son's racist harassment, something fundamental shifted. "This is my son?" he asked quietly, his face ashen. "This is your son, Doctor?" Morrison confirmed. "And these are the consequences." Bradley's final surrender came when he realized even his father couldn't spin 18 minutes of recorded evidence. The golden boy who'd terrorized Riverside High for 2 years crumbled completely, sobbing apologies that came far too late to matter. By Monday morning, Riverside High was a different place. Students walked taller, spoke louder, and carried themselves with a confidence that hadn't existed the week before. The toxic atmosphere that had poisoned the school for years had been lifted like a dark cloud. Teachers reported dramatic changes in classroom dynamics. Students who'd been silent were participating. Kids who'd been isolated were making friends. The culture shift was immediate and unmistakable. Naomi found her classroom filled with flowers, thank you notes, and requests for mentorship. Students who'd never spoken to her before were asking to join a self-defense club she hadn't even proposed yet. "Miss Parker," said Ashley, a sophomore who'd been one of Marcus's victims, "would you teach us how to stand up for ourselves like you did?" Similar requests came from dozens of students. They wanted to learn not just physical self-defense, but the psychological strength to face down bullies and authority figures who abused their power. Jessica Chen, who'd been quiet in class discussions, became a powerful voice for change. She started a peer support group for bullying victims and emerged as a natural leader. David Rodriguez, who'd been targeted for his accent, found his voice through poetry and creative writing in Naomi's class. His piece about identity and belonging was published in the school literary magazine. Even some of Bradley's former followers underwent dramatic transformations. Students who'd enabled the toxic culture out of fear or social pressure began speaking out against bullying and supporting targeted classmates. The most surprising change came from Coach Patterson, the football coach who'd protected Bradley for years. Faced with evidence of his star player's criminal behavior, he implemented a zero-tolerance policy for harassment and began teaching character development alongside athletics. Dr. Morrison used the crisis as an opportunity to implement sweeping policy changes. Anonymous reporting systems were expanded, teacher training on harassment was mandated, and consequences for bullying were strengthened. But the real change was cultural. Students policed themselves, calling out inappropriate behavior and supporting vulnerable classmates. The unspoken rule that power came from intimidation was replaced by a new understanding that strength came from lifting others up. Naomi found herself at the center of this transformation, not as a ruler but as a catalyst. Students sought her advice. Teachers collaborated on her innovative approaches, and parents who'd once been suspicious became her strongest advocates. The story of what happened at Riverside High spread far beyond the school's boundaries. Local news picked up the story, focusing on how one teacher's courage had transformed an entire school culture. Social media amplified the message, with students sharing their own stories of overcoming bullying and finding their voices. The hashtag #RiversideRespect trended locally, inspiring similar movements at other schools. Naomi began receiving invitations to speak at education conferences, teacher training programs, and anti-bullying workshops. Her story became a case study in how individual courage could create systemic change. 6 months later, the transformation was complete and permanent. Students who'd lived in fear were thriving academically and socially. Graduation rates improved. college acceptance letters increased, and disciplinary problems plummeted. Ashley started a non-profit organization focused on supporting young victims of cyberbullying. Jessica was accepted to her dream college with a full scholarship, crediting her newfound confidence to the changes at Riverside. Even the perpetrators found redemption through accountability. Marcus, facing criminal charges, entered a rehabilitation program and began working with younger students about the dangers of exploitative behavior. Tyler used his community service hours to repair damage he'd caused and eventually became an advocate for responsible driving. Bradley's transformation was the most dramatic. Expelled from Riverside and facing social ostracism, he was forced to confront the toxic attitudes that had shaped his worldview. Through mandatory counseling and community service, he slowly began understanding the harm he'd caused. Riverside High became a model for other schools struggling with bullying and discrimination. Educators from across the region visited to study their transformation and implement similar programs. The changes attracted positive attention to the district, improving property values and drawing families who valued inclusive education. The school's reputation shifted from academically excellent but culturally problematic to a place where all students can thrive. Local businesses began supporting anti-bullying initiatives, and community leaders pointed to Riverside as an example of positive change through individual courage. The Virginia Department of Education adopted Riverside's policies as statewide recommendations. Naomi's approach to combining academic excellence with character development became a template for teacher training programs. Universities began studying the Riverside model as an example of how individual leadership could create systemic change. Education researchers documented the dramatic improvements in student outcomes and teacher retention. Naomi's story inspired educators across the country to stand up to bullying and discrimination in their own schools. Social media filled with stories of teachers finding their courage and students discovering their voices. The message resonated beyond education. In workplaces, communities, and families, people began understanding that individual courage could challenge systems of oppression and create lasting change. 3 years later, Naomi Parker's confrontation with Bradley Hutchinson had become legend at Riverside High. New students heard the story during orientation. Teachers shared it during training, and alumni recounted it at reunions. The parking lot where it happened was informally known as Parker's Place. Though Naomi discouraged the hero worship, she'd never sought fame or recognition, just the right to do her job with dignity and respect. But legends take on lives of their own, and Naomi's story grew with each telling. Some versions included flying kicks and dramatic one-liners. Others focused on the social media aftermath and policy changes. All of them captured the essential truth. One person's courage had changed everything. The story of Riverside High carried a message that resonated across American culture, that bullying thrives in silence but crumbles when faced with courage. That systems of oppression depend on victim compliance and collapse when individuals refuse to submit. Most importantly, it demonstrated that heroes aren't born from privilege or power, but from the decision to stand up. When standing up matters most, Naomi Parker hadn't set out to be a symbol or a legend. She'd simply refused to accept that her dignity was negotiable. Her story became a reminder that change doesn't require special powers or unique circumstances. It requires ordinary people choosing to do extraordinary things when faced with injustice. If you've ever been bullied, discriminated against, or made to feel like you don't belong, remember Naomi Parker's story. Remember that your voice matters. Your dignity is non-negotiable, and your courage can change the world. Share your own stories of standing up to injustice. Support teachers and students who face discrimination. Refuse to be a bystander when you witness bullying or harassment. Because the truth is, we all have the power to be the person who changes everything. We all have the ability to transform toxic cultures into inclusive communities. We all can choose courage over comfort, justice over silence. Years later, when Naomi finally wrote her memoir, she dedicated it to her students, not just at Riverside, but everywhere, to every student who ever felt like they didn't belong. She wrote, "Remember that belonging isn't about changing yourself to fit their world. It's about having the courage to change their world to include you." The girl from Detroit who'd learned to fight in cages had discovered her true calling: teaching others that the most important battles aren't won with fists, but with dignity, courage, and an unshakable belief in your own worth. And in a small suburban high school in Virginia, her legend continues to inspire new generations of students to stand tall, speak up, and never, ever, back down from bullies who mistake kindness for weakness. Because sometimes the most powerful punch is the one you don't throw. Sometimes the greatest victory is the one that changes hearts instead of breaking faces. And sometimes a teacher with an MMA background is exactly what a school needs to learn, that real strength comes from protecting the vulnerable, not exploiting them. The story of Naomi Parker reminds us all that heroes walk among us every day, teaching our children, shaping our future, and proving that courage is contagious when someone brave enough to stand first